G'day, Cameron. How are you going?
Good, Jonathan. Good to be back with you.
Yeah, so today I thought I'd explore one of these topics with you that always comes to my mind when I'm listening to news reports, and it's about productivity. It's often a term that comes up in news reporting of economic performance, and this term productivity, it strikes me just listening recently to a Canadian radio show. It's a CBC radio program about how productivity
Hmm.
growth is low and in fact going backwards in some sectors. And I remember reading that it was going backwards in construction in Australia, in the construction sector. And I just thought, yeah, it just does seem that this word productivity is used in a different sense by economists than it's used in everyday language. So I thought it's time to explore this with you. So tell me, productivity,
Yeah.
what does it mean?
Look, I'm glad that came across your radar, Jonathan, because I've been meaning to dig into this. I actually have a draft article of what's going on with this worldwide decline in construction productivity, like for decades, right?
Uh-huh.
And you're right that economists use the word to mean something different. So let me start by maybe breaking that down. So economists use productivity to mean actually two different things, two different things to your normal layperson. The first is called labor productivity, which is essentially the sum of new goods and services produced in the economy divided by the number of work hours that year. Right. And the idea is, we want more productive people, right? So if we can produce more stuff for the same work hours, that means we're getting richer, right? We've got
Right.
more stuff to consume, but the same amount of work. That's the definition of becoming wealthier. And so we sort of have in mind that productivity is a great thing. So that's labor productivity. We're doing more stuff per work hour. And then we have this other thing called multi-factor productivity. And multi-factor productivity is not just how much stuff we made in a year divided by the work hours. It's divided by the work hours plus the capital input. So the buildings, machines, equipment that exist out there in the economy, right? And the
Right.
idea there is, to get even more growth, we need to do better per person plus their equipment. Can we organize in a better way? Now, that second one, total factor productivity, it's quite interesting because Robert Solow originally sort of identified that there's something that causes economic growth. It's not more capital, more buildings, machines, and equipment, or more people working. There's some extra thing. And he's called it the Solow residual or the unexplained part. And it's quite funny that economists obsess about this thing that we can't explain, the Solow residual or the unexplained residual. So for my mind, productivity, we can park total factor productivity. I don't think it's a useful thing. It,
Uh-huh.
it varies based on measurement and the business cycle, and it's just too hard to conceptually pin down. But I think labor productivity is still quite useful because we can know how many people worked. And but it's quite interesting because um, there's a bunch of reasons why labor productivity can grow or can't grow in an economy. And that podcast you talked about in Canada was very interesting because it said, oh, in some sectors, labor productivity is growing well, and in others, it's not. And I thought, isn't that interesting, right? What leads to that? And economists are a funny bunch. They don't really have good answers. They've been writing about this decline in construction sector productivity for decades without good answers. But I have a few insights that might help us piece that together. And
Okay.
and why don't I start by looking at this photo I've got up on my screen, which you can't see, but I'll describe it. It's a
Okay.
photo of a Brisbane housing subdivision in 1950. And I'm looking, and there's no stormwater drains on the roads. There's no bitumen. There's a few fences, but not that many. There's no garden edges. There's no pools. There's no plumbing. There's a row of outdoor toilets. There's no concrete, not a single piece of concrete in the whole photo. So what I'm getting at is that in the construction sector, well, we compare today and 1950 and say, how many dwellings can we build per person working in construction? I look at what houses used to look like and I go, you're just not measuring the same thing, right?
Right.
You're measuring essentially a large wooden kid's cubby house with no plumbing, no power, no concrete driveway, no sewer, no carport, no stormwater, no earthworks, and a modern sort of 4 bedroom, 3 bathroom, double lockup garage, air conditioned, insulated
Hmm.
house with landscaping and fences and solar panels on the roof and all the rest.
Hmm.
And I think if you correctly adjusted for that compositional change, the quality change, I think you'll find that we're not sort of magically forgetting how to produce new homes. We're just producing better ones and really bad at measuring. I think it's mostly a measurement issue. So
But
yeah, it's a
you're using a baseline that's quite a long way in the past. I'm thinking like if you used 1980 as a benchmark, say, um, maybe a lot of those things, were that you mentioned were there in 1980. I don't know. Let's say more of them were. But maybe there's a lot more safety rules. Maybe there's a lot more technology involved that takes up people's time to, I don't know, like technology is supposed to make things more efficient. Is it possible in
mm,
construction the technology makes things easier for the workers, but kind of actually brings down productivity?
yeah, that is one argument, right? That you're adding extra workers who aren't actually resulting in more houses. So the guys who bring the site fencing and deliver it and put it around your site while you're constructing and then take it away, that's just pure extra labor for the same house that was built, right?
Yeah.
Oh, the safety inspector who checks the various stage completion. Well, he's not creating more houses himself. If you didn't need him, you'd have higher labor productivity. So you're
Right.
right that these rules do add costs. And of course, the economist in me says, well, is the cost worth the benefit? Like how many people die on construction sites these days? Oh, it's probably a trade off we should think about. And
Hmm.
we should do these procedures in the most efficient way possible. Like, if you can automate, fence construction, you should do it and have the fewest people involved as you can. But that's certainly a trade off in the economy. And there's definitely an element of that, right? Um,
Yeah.
in construction, there's another element, though, and that's that the density of what we build today is much, much higher. And so an apartment in a high rise just literally needs more concrete, steel, digging, design work, you name it, for an identical internal apartment than one in a 2 or 3 story walk up sort of 1970s block, right?
Uh-huh.
So, and even if they're priced the same in the market, you just literally need more manpower to build the higher density one. And on average, dwellings these days are getting to be higher and higher density each period. And that's a global trend as well. And I think that's part of the, um, global, oh, we're declining in productivity. Oh, but we're actually just building, one apartment tower with 100 dwellings in it instead of 10, walk up apartments with 100 dwellings. One of them's going
Yeah.
to use more manpower for the same, output, but we're missing that quality adjustment element that 100 buildings in 100 apartments in a tower is qualitatively different.
Yeah. There's a different thing. Okay. Um, let's just broaden out the discussion from construction. Let's say, just generally speaking,
Mm,
what economists are talking about most of the time is technology comes into an industry and improves how much is produced per hour, right? Is that
hmm
usually the thing that boosts productivity? Um, and if
Yep.
that's the case, then um, can it be that um, we don't always necessarily want productivity growth because, like, we know that efficiency is one thing, but it's also like where there are other considerations. Like we might want to have sovereignty. We might want to have an inefficient factory on our soil producing a very important thing, like, I don't know, face masks or whatever it is. Maybe that's not a good example, but you know what I
Yeah.
mean, like something medical or something that's essential for the broader economy. And okay, yeah, it's probably, cheaper done in somewhere else, but you know, just
Yeah.
necessary. Yeah.
I see what you're saying. You're right. There's sort of a non-productivity related reason to do certain things, and I'm totally on board. I just I'm not sure productivity is a useful measurement and a useful guide for whether we're succeeding in what we want as a society or as an economy. I just not sure that it's that useful, even though the concept kind of makes sense, right? If you're on a desert island with three of you and you can catch, 10 fish per day instead of three fish per day, you've more than tripled your productivity, and that's good for you. But I think in a large, complex economy like we have, the measurement gets overwhelmed. So I'll give you an example, right? Productivity output per worker is very easy to increase in industries with economies of scale, right?
Yeah.
Manufacturing, IT, that sort of stuff, but almost impossible in service sector work like being a lawyer, getting a massage, getting a haircut, right? Um, how many haircuts per hour can you do today compared to 1,000 years ago? Probably a similar number, right? And so if your economy
What about the
changes,
lawyer thing? The lawyers, just the AI can do the lawyer's job.
well, it sort of depends on how you measure, right? Measuring the output of a lawyer's services is almost measuring its input, right? You like what's the unit of measurement? Advice, quality adjusted advice
Yeah.
length. You know what I mean? Like you almost, and I'll come back to that measuring outputs by inputs in a moment, because that's another factor when we take all the sectors of the economy together. So I guess before we get to that, yeah, your point is that we should do some economic activity because it's socially beneficial, but it might be bad for productivity. For example, having more service workers and less manufacturing is going to mechanically reduce labor productivity in an economy because manufacturing has economies of scale. You can produce a lot of stuff per worker. Yes, you need to build machines and buildings and whatnot, but per work hour, it's quite good. And then you've got a lot of consultants, hairdressers, public service people, even doctors, nurses, police officers, teachers. Literally, there's no change. So the more we shift into those sectors, the less we can get as a total macroeconomy gains in labor productivity. And I suspect that's a little bit of the story behind the divergence between the US and Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and for example, the US, for example, has a lot of IT sector where there's huge economies of scale, right? Twitter notoriously now only has hundreds of employees, right? But it's a massive,
Yep.
many, many billion-dollar outfit, right? Some of these IT companies are worth more than massive car companies with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of global employees, and they have hardly any employees. So when you start measuring output in terms of the dollar value of IT services divided by the labor input, you start really, really boosting that up. And hence, when you add that into the mix, getting a really good output, like
Yeah.
productivity measurement. And the same thing with the boost in US manufacturing. There's a big onshoring effort, and that's sort of a policy based effort. The CHIPS Act and others to subsidize global firms to bring manufacturing onshore in the US. Well, of course, you're adding to the economy, high economies of scale industry by pure compositional effects, that's going to add to labor productivity. Whereas in Australia, Canada, for example, we're doing none of that. We don't have a big global IT sector. We're not attracting uh, industries back to the country that are high economies of scale manufacturing, but we are shifting heavily into service sector, areas, and so that change, the relative measurement means well, Australia and Canada look like they're going backwards compared to
Mhm.
America if we only look at productivity. But if we look at,
Yep.
well, what are we doing? What's the compositional thing? Do we want to subsidize manufacturing here? Is it even reasonable to expect us to have global IT companies here? And if so, how would we do it? What's stopping them now? So I think,
Mhm.
yeah, it's interesting, but I think there's more to the story.
Yeah, okay. And yet we're constantly told, oh, it's so important. This is the most important thing. And there's a productivity commission that is just like, that's their thing.
Yeah.
Like it's supposed to be super important.
Like I get it, the idea of producing more output with the same number of people is conceptually very useful. But in practice and the measurement of it and the way we have the debates, I think is really sort of missing the main elements. And um, let me just give you another example. When you have an economic boom, what you often find is productivity falls, right? Because unemployment goes down. You've got these sort of low productive workers being sucked in. You've got a lot of workers devoted to sort of planning and designing, next year's houses and next year's road construction, but no real output for them yet. And so you find that when there's a boom, productivity often falls. And when there's a recession, labor productivity often rises because fewer people are working, but those who are there, the amount of output doesn't fall as much as the amount of labor input falls. And you're like, well,
Yeah.
that's backwards, right? That's exactly backwards. So then, if that's true, why would we use productivity as a metric upon which we evaluate our policy decisions? And my answer is, well, you know, although the concept's useful, the metric can't just be interpreted without a huge amount of background understanding.
Hmm. Does it cause you to think, there's just so much in my discipline that is hand waving kind of obfuscation and kind of
Yeah,
unscientific thinking.
this,
What's the point of economics if there's all this sort of
well,
just
I think
nonsense?
we're getting back to it's very convenient for certain groups to say, oh, productivity, we shouldn't pay construction workers too much, right? Because they're not being productive. Um, there's a
That's
lot
right.
of lot of motivated reasoning and a lot of economic incentives. But yeah, I think if you're having an honest debate, and I think a lot of academics are more honest about what productivity can and can't say, and where the issues arise. Like for example, I think it was Ireland um, introduced some tax breaks, and all the European aeroplane leasing companies shifted their headquarters into Ireland to get tax breaks. And then the question is, well, your headquarters there, should we count in Ireland's GDP the value of all those planes that are flying around in other countries, to and from different cities in Eastern Europe? How is that adding to Ireland's GDP? Oh, because some money gets funneled through the leasing head office. And so you have this issue of, well, Ireland has this great productivity boom, but on the street it's literally some PO boxes and lawyers um,
Yeah.
managing multi-billion dollar annual aircraft leasing contracts. And everyone knows that it's a measurement issue in that situation. But in general, we just then go, oh, it's a measurement issue there, but it's not a measurement issue in general. I'm like, what do you think in general is? It's just the sum of all these little measurement issues, right? That we struggle to
Yep.
deal with, right? It's literally a weighted average of your struggle with measurement issues on both
Yep.
sides. And to
Yep.
just to wrap up one of the points I flagged earlier about measuring outputs by inputs, there's a great article by the ABS that says, uh, you know, it's called Interpreting ABS Productivity Statistics. And one of the interesting things is that they say, oh, so this, measuring non-market productivity, we've got this work from home boom, but we don't count housing in the sort of inputs for um, business production, right?
Okay.
Nor the cost of it. So that's an interesting one. But I'm just scrolling down to see where it is. The point they mentioned something like for certain sectors, for example, the public service or the hospitals or the schools, to measure output, because there's no price and no product, right? Quantity that we can price and keep track of. They just measure outputs by inputs, right? This is how GDP
What?
also. So,
Yeah.
so if the government spends $10 billion on public schools, we
Yeah.
go, yes, that's $10 billion worth of GDP in whatever $10 billion of this year's value is relative to the rest of the economy, right?
Right.
But if we spend $10 billion on schools and sell those services for 20 billion, right? Then in a private sector education system, you can track that market price and go, oh, look, Now we're getting more value measured by the market price of private education services per worker, right? We're actually now measuring a different thing on the output side than the input side when it comes to the inputs and outputs to private education, because there's prices on both sides of that, right? You can measure
Yeah.
the market price of sales, but in public education, you can't. That's true in healthcare and the military and all of that as well. So there's a, that issue comes not just in productivity, but in GDP measurement, right? Um, how do we measure non-priced things in GDP? And it's the same in productivity. When we try and add up the whole economy, you're like, well, okay, if we're shifting to services, if we've got a large public healthcare system rather to a private one, well, we're not going to ever see productivity gains in a public health system because we're measuring its output by its input costs. But in a private system, we can measure that. Oh, the pharmaceutical sector, they produced all these extra drugs for the same amount of workers, right? Okay, let's add that up. But if it's sort of
Yeah.
more public, you don't get that measurement change.
So yeah, just to wrap up, I guess my head's very much in AI, and I'm very pessimistic about all sorts of things connected with AI. So my question is, we're about to see a massive explosion probably in productivity because we're going to have a lot fewer workers required to do a lot, required to do all the things that we do now.
Mm,
Um, and there's going to be a lot of social disruption from that. And there's going to be, this is just, me throwing it out there for you to respond to, and not
yeah.
just a lot of disruption, but a lot of special pleading, like oh no, my you're going to have a law to stop my sector from being done by AI. It's too important. They'll have to ban AI and protect this, of doctors and whatever, and pharmacists and whatever. It's going to be like a trench warfare for everyone, trying to protect themselves. Anyway, bottom line,
Yeah.
um, labor productivity is going to go sky high, but it's going to be really bad. What do you think?
Yeah, it's hard to tell, right? Because as I said, AI is going to change service sector jobs that do a lot of reading and writing and image manipulation and stuff like that. And already those are sectors that where measured productivity is not really changing a lot. And it's very hard to measure the output, as I said, of a lawyer, right? What's the
But
output of one
isn't it going
hour's
to make
legal advice? Well, it's one
yeah.
hour's legal advice. You see
But
what I
isn't it going to
mean?
make producing stuff like cars or houses a lot quicker and cheaper and done with a lot fewer people?
Well, I'd like to think that that's the case. I mean, that's the type of thing that economists have in mind when they say technology enhances productivity. It's, well, we can replace 10 guys on the work floor with one guy and an AI tool to keep track of things and do the same task. Now that'd be great. And if it's true, that's good, right? Because the economy adjusts over time. That's sort of one of the reasons economists get very evangelical about the economy and the market economy is because we can all trade and switch jobs and expand to fill niches. It's good that people lose their jobs, just like it's good that the guy digging by hand to, dig holes and put up telephone poles doesn't have a job anymore. But the guy who drives the truck with the automatic post hole digger and the little crane and lift to automatically do it, well, he's got a job. Yeah, he replaced 10 or 20 guys digging with shovels. But because the economy adjusts and we find other ways for people to sort of do productive things or teach them how to operate things, the new tools and the new machines, that's great. I mean, that's a good thing in my view. And if we can replace some of the more routine and mundane service sector consulting jobs, or the guy at the architecture firm who's just clicking constantly all day to do very basic things with little human input, that an AI could just take his idea and get the basics done. I think that's you know unambiguously a positive thing. And I just don't think most of the time these adjustments in the economy take a while, and different sectors start and experiment and then other sectors do. So it's not like um, a once-off shock where everybody suddenly loses their lawyer job or whatever in one go, right? It'll be a process of change that I think will be a net benefit over time. What do you think? Do you see it that way, or you're more
Mm.
concerned?
Yeah, well, I think you're projecting from past experience to the future, and I think maybe this time those past experiences will not be a good guide. But
Mm.
actually, this leads into something else that I'm interested in, but I think we'll leave that for the next discussion, and that's universal basic income. But yeah, thanks for today's discussion on productivity, and yeah, look forward to chatting about some of the more science fiction-y things coming up next time.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm hoping to write more about the construction productivity mystery on the Fresh Economic Thinking website. So hopefully listeners keep track of that and read that in the coming months.
Brilliant. Talk soon. Thanks, Cameron.